All right. Welcome back, everybody. Start welcoming everybody back here and get started here in a little bit so we can give our panelists the most amount of time as we can. Welcome back to our closing session here at the Midwest BDC's 2022 Equity Summit. I'm Jacob Serfling, one of the co-directors here at Midwest BDC. And at our coalition, we have been focusing on centering BIPOC communities throughout this summit. Yesterday, our closing panel was on Indigenous land back, and on Wednesday, our closing panel was on reparations. So today we will have a joint conversation with folks from both of those panels and keynote speakers, Tamara, Toles, O'Loughlin, and Dr. Harvell, to try to bring together members of Black and Indigenous tribal communities to get an understanding of the barriers and false narratives and work past them to create alignment for energy sovereignty and solidarity. So with that being said, I will bring back our moderator, Russell Rabb of the Russell Rabb Show. And welcome back Tamara, Sam Grant, Dr. Harvell, Kaela, Wabanimkee-Harris, Adelita, Serena, Colette, Yellow Robe, Michael Imhotep, Michaela Stith. The full bios can be found on the summit page. I believe Maggie will drop in the chat. But welcome back, everybody. And just an FYI for those of you who are joining us later in the day, we did have a little bit of a Zoom incident earlier this morning. So we'll be taking you off of mute as we go through the panel discussion, just so that we can keep this a safe space for everybody participating today. So thank you for your patience with that. Just raise your hand with the Zoom reactions and we'll make sure that you get unmuted. So with that being said, I'm gonna take Russell off of mute and get out of his way so we can have this discussion.
Hey, there we go. Absolutely. This is going to be great. Bringing both sides together because we have so many people on our panel right now. We're going to ask that we keep things pretty precise and concise of what you're saying. I know that's a lot of information, and sometimes we can go a little longer, but we have a lot of people to get to. So just to set that right there. So 2 to 3 minutes, if you can, with your responses and answers to the questions that I have. So we're going to start off at the top with Adelita. This is for you. How do reparations and land back efforts align? 2 minutes, please.
Hi, everyone. Adelita Serena here. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Really important question, and really reparation consists of 3 important things, and that is acknowledgement, redress, and of course closure. Redress, really important, is making those wrongs right. So that acknowledgement's critical. It means acknowledging that our government needs to acknowledge, the violent taking of the land that took place, the violence that occurred when slavery was forced upon, the Black community, and also, making sure that they address the wealth gap that has created, right? And how does that happen? It happens with payment. It happens with, the apology that has never taken place. No real national apology has ever taken place for the violent taking of this land and for slavery and the populations that were victimized because of that, and the ongoing historical trauma that our communities have faced. And there's a lot of resistance to that. There's been some efforts, of course. There's a lot of resistance towards critical race theory, right? And that is because if this is then taught in schools, then, the truth will begin to surface. And if that happens, if the truth surfaces, then there will have to be, the reckoning of that truth and the grappling with who is going to be receiving apologies and who's going to be receiving payments for, and what does that look like? Is it land back? Is it payments? Either way, our communities have been suffering from the colonization, and that is, with, again, literacy issues, wealth gap, land that has been taken and by white people,
Right.
by the colonizers, is now given them wealth. And so what does reparations look like? What is that? How do these align for both Black and Indigenous communities? It means that, our communities have paid the biggest price, and now it's time to address that. And that means, the apology comes, it means the redress, it means closure. And that means checks need to be handed out, because it has been done in the past. We have issued checks through the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. The Japanese Americans who survived internment camps, were issued checks. So
Absolutely.
It can be done. It can be done is what I'm saying.
No, absolutely. I don't, I mean to cut you off.
Yeah.
I know, because this same question is also going to go over to Michael. How do reparations and land back efforts align? So if you could, please. Thank you.
All right. And do I have my slides? I do have my slides. Can I show my slides?
Let me see if you have access to that.
Host disabled participant screen sharing. I spent 4 hours putting together these slides.
One second. One second.
Let me see what
Hold
we
on.
can do.
Thanks. All right. So to answer the question, I'm gonna give two quick examples. Yes, to answer the question of how do reparations and land back efforts align? Both African Americans and Native Americans were both enslaved in this country. The enslavement of African Americans is more well known. Native American slavery, quote, is a piece of the history of slavery that has been glossed over, said Linford D. Fisher, Associate Professor of History at Brown University. There's a good article and I can show you the slide in just a second as soon as you get it ready. Colonial enslavement of Native Americans included those who surrendered to. A good example would be King Philip's War, 1675-1676 in the colony of New England. And this was a war to avoid the enslavement of Native Americans. And during this war, the colony of New England routinely shipped Native Americans and slaves to Barbados, which was a British colony, Bermuda, Jamaica, the Azores, Spain, and Tangier in North Africa. We know about the enslavement of 12.5 million African Americans between 388. Do we have this? Can I share the slide?
Yes. Yep.
Okay,
we're good.
We're
good.
Thank you. We know 12.5 million African Americans are taken out between about 1441, when the Portuguese get involved in the transatlantic slave trade, in 1888, when Brazil ends the transatlantic slave trade. Okay. Native American land was not only stolen, but over 300 peace treaties were violated, and they were also enslaved. African Americans had their land stolen after the Civil War ends and after the Black Freedmen Indian treaties of 1866. There has to be a repairing of the damage done both for African Americans and Native Americans. Research the information dealing with King Philip's War. Check out the article from brown.edu. Colonial enslavement of Native Americans included those who surrendered. Lastly, there's a good article dealing with Bacon's Rebellion, 1676. So at the same time that you have the King Philip War in the colony of New England. In the colony of Virginia, you have what's known as Bacon's Rebellion, where you have enslaved Africans, you have poor Irish, you have white indentured servants. They all unite to fight against their common oppressor because they're being exploited on the tobacco plantations in New England, in Virginia, okay? What happens is during the decades of the 1650s and 1660s, a sizable number of indentured servants, Black and white, who had completed their required indentured labor service, clamored for old Powhatan land. This is a Native American nation. And what you're going to see take place is that after Bacon's Rebellion ends in 1676, in about 1681 in the colony of Virginia, they're going to institute the term white for what we refer to as Europeans. And we're going to see this go throughout the rest of the 13 colonies. The colonial leaders found a solution to both their problems. They had a problem of how to maintain control over the restless poor and the freedmen, and they had the second dilemma of how to obtain a controllable labor force as cheaply as possible. What they did was they introduced the term white, and this homogenized all Europeans, and this was a category, and they instituted a system of permanent slavery for Africans, or chattel slavery, who were the most vulnerable members of the population. And this was specifically done to break up the alliance of poor white people, white indentured servants, and enslaved African people. And we still are dealing with the repercussions of this today.
Thank you so much, Michael. Man, so much powerful. And by the way, all the slides that you're seeing are also available. So if you're here and you're wondering, can those be available to you? They are. I have a question just to move around the panel here a bit, and this is going to go over to Colette. What does it mean to be both Black and Indigenous?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Professor, for just showing that law. I want to make a very clear point that us getting the education about how that dividing magical line started to separate us and erase us is so tantamount, and we need to always remember that in order to think about it is about not having complete competitive solidarity. It's about having creative solutions. So I will fall back on my area in Indigenous futurism and Afro-Indigenous futurism. It is about creating solidarity that is not creating division. The settler colonialism, that's the true enemy, if you will. That's the true target that we're trying to take down. And we have to remember it's going to divide us out no matter what, instead of celebrating our unique tribal, no matter where they are. We all are descended from the strongest of the strong, and the settler colonialism is the one true entity that would have us believe it's not real, even though it's fully pervasive and infected absolutely everything. Being up in Canada now, things look a little different, but it is very much a suppression of voice. So I would say a more concrete answer to Mr. Russell's question would be non-suppression of Black and Indigenous voices, period. Just no more suppressing of truth and voice would be my first step, my first request for all of classrooms. Pretty pithy today, Russell, so we can pass it on.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna go over to Sam. Mr. Sam Graham, how's it going, man? One second.
Yep.
Can we hear you?
Yep. Can you hear me now?
Okay, there it is.
I had to wait to be unmuted.
Yeah, I know. It's a bit of a wait. So everyone, once I go to you, there's a bit of a pause so we can unmute you. So just give it 1 second to this before you speak. So Sam, same question. What does it mean to be both Black and Indigenous?
So picking up on what's been shared so far, I think that there is an important story to tell about the intermingling of Black and Indigenous people throughout the history on Turtle Island. So my family is part Gullah Geechee because, we escaped, to the Seacoast Islands, but my family also carries heritage lines from the Choctaw and the Chickasaw people because my family lined up with them. So many of us have those stories. Vine Deloria Jr. wrote this great book in 1967 called Custer Died for Your Sins. And chapter 8 speaks to his articulation of the challenge in terms of the internalized understanding of Black people as Black people fought for racial justice in the United States of America compared to Indigenous people who were fighting for sovereignty, in the United States of America. And so he was sort of making an articulation of an argument for red and Black solidarity. And it's an unfinished conversation that I'm excited about us sharing. So as we think about Indigenous people are all over the world. 5% of the global population, but protecting 80% of the remaining biodiversity on the planet. There's an amazing opportunity for people across all of the hues of people to align around defending Indigenous people's rights to the land and sovereignty in order to address the climate crisis, and also in order to repair the way we've related to each other throughout the whole history of colonialism and set a new norm in the 21st century where the land can be well and all of the people can be well. So when I think about Black and red, I'm really thinking about my home place. So my own identity is both, it's Black and red. And yet when I'm in a space that's entirely Indigenous, sometimes people just recognize my Blackness, but not my complexness. So there's stories I can tell about that. And the similar thing happens when I'm in an entirely Black space and I'm speaking to a complex identity that braids the Black and the red together. People often have been taught and trained to think in a divisive way because we live in a divisive world, and we fail to see the intersectionality of our lives, stories, and narratives around liberation of all people on the land.
Wow, powerful. And right on the money with that. Moving over to Kaela. Yeah, I know you have some difficulty there. Kaela, you there? All right, I can come back around to her.
I'm here. I'm here. Sorry,
okay.
My screen froze.
But you with us now?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, so you'll be the last one to close out this question here of what does it mean to be both Black and Indigenous to you?
Well, to me, it's about walking in more than one world. We're already in the Western civilization trying to uphold our traditional practices. And then when you add in being mixed with that, it's like 3-4 different worlds you're trying to navigate and walk in. And for me, as someone who is of mixed ancestry, I just don't like the assimilation tactics of it all. So for me, I'm an Anishinaabe woman. And despite my multiracial ancestry, I identify as Anishinaabe, and everyone identifies differently who ancestry. Some people call themselves Afro-Anishinaabe. I don't use that. I'm Anishinaabe regardless of those mixtures, and everyone is different when it comes to those things. Everyone identifies how they prefer to be identified. So I feel like it's a hot topic, and it's just something that you grow into. You find how you prefer to identify. And I a lot of I don't know, it's a hot topic, but to keep it quick, that's for me, that's what works for me, and that's how I walk in this world. And I can understand, some of my friends and even some of my own family members, we all look different. Some of us are lighter, some of us are darker, some of us, you might look at me and not think I'm Black at all. But if you look at my dad and my grandfather, you see that, but you wouldn't know that just looking at me. And so it's not about passing or trying to pass. If you sit and talk with me, I'll tell you about my family history. But until that comes, I'm Anishinaabe, period. So that's how I answer that. And just real quick, because I got into it, and I'm kind of, I'm very sensitive on this topic, but Ani Buju, the Bikanako in addition to Cus, Venetian Dodo, Nidipat and Donjiba, and Anishinaabe Playanda. And Miigwech for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just going to go around the board because I know that there's those that weren't here with us the first 2 days. At the ending closing session is Dr. Harvell, as well as Chairman Tlayolotl. So same question to you, Tamara. Give you a second.
Hi, so I'm Tamara Toles,
Tamara, I'm sorry.
and I'm glad to be here. And I was wearing this shirt before I remembered I was doing this panel. So just need you to know that this is not like that. This is a very big conversation. We're not going to get to any of it in the time that we have, frankly. And I think the idea of trying to hold this kind of conversation from the perspective of our various cosmologies, relationships, understandings, and our political praxis would be also pretty difficult. Given the framing of the conversation around building decarbonization, I think it's important to pull back into a systems level analysis, because all of what was already been discussed by these incredible panelists is really about us having to prove our identities in relationship to whiteness, which is a social construct, right? So like, to avoid delving into the abyss of this thing that America was created to make happen, it might be easier for us to pull back and talk about building decarbonization as a strategy to do the work that colonialism has left for us to do. So given that the planet is in a crisis, we are hemorrhaging our species, our capacity, and the Earth's energy at a rate that is totally unsustainable. The questions of why we're doing that are really related to colonialism. And so the plight and the parallel nature of being able to end our relationship to fossil fuels because of the harm it's causing to people and planet is bigger than any of our single identities, and is much more about the climate crisis being the end game of a design that caused all these problems. And so I'm really excited to be in this conversation, to talk about what it would mean to have a conceptualization of racial equity that is not separate from how we design what happens next. So really excited to not just talk about my own experience, but really turn the camera back on the system itself. That's put us in a moment where if we don't get the answers to the questions around racial equity when we need them, and reckon with the idea that reparations and climate reparations, which is my real jam, which is about talking about the economics of trying to right both of these wrongs at the same time, requires us to recognize that we're not only in relationship, we're in deep relationship, because both the groups of people that were in the subject of the question predate America. So for those groups to have to be held up to define themselves through a thing that came after them seems a little difficult to hold. And so just wanted to level set and say, I don't think we're going to get all the way there, but I do think it's really important for us to flag that from the perspective of someone who spends a lot of time working on climate to make sure that my people and all of the versions of that identity exist in the future. It's really tough to have anything other than sovereignty with the folks whose land I am on, right? Because the lands that my people are indigenous to are many. Some here, some there. And so I think it's really important for us not to lean towards that and to push back and say, okay, where is the place where both indigenous people who are indigenous to these lands and people who are indigenous to the African diaspora recognize they have commonality in an argument around America showing up in the middle of our existence? And that's a deep question. So I will hand it back, but just wanted to say that I appreciate everybody in this space. We are trying to tame a tiger in 10 minutes, and I look forward to seeing where we get.
Well, yes, absolutely. And I agree 100% that it's a lot to condense into a small space, and trying to get that information out. And I feel bad for condensing everyone. So I got to keep it at this point where there's so much to be covered. There's so many people that are watching, that are listening, that will hear this, that are completely ignorant and may not know any of this. So it's a beginning portion. It's something to get that information out. And I understand completely what you mean. But as we are here, we're just trying to get this to everyone as we possibly can within this amount of time. So with that being said, on this last question here to Dr. Harvell, and I welcome you to the stage. Dr. Harvell, you there?
Yes, I am.
All right, thank you. You weren't here yesterday when we were speaking, so welcome to our panel, and thank you. And the question also applies to you as well. What does it mean to be both Black and Indigenous?
That's a wonderful question. but I think that we need to, and this is no offense to my illustrious panelists, I think we need to take a step back from that particular question in the ways in which it's been formatted. The question itself is a product of a Eurocentric worldview. We have to address the issue of colonial disempowerment and the ways in which colonial disempowerment works to erase identity. And so when we start to make these distinctions, which these distinctions, of course, we want to be able to define folks, but a part of these distinctions in and of themselves are putting folks into boxes that work effectively to dehumanize those folks. So for example, yesterday I talked about the notion of what I call disruptive pedagogy. Disruptive pedagogy is this idea that we need to get away from the language of the oppressors and begin to define our reality and define ourselves for ourselves using and constructing our own unique worldview, therefore using our culture as the standard for our own definitions. And so I talked about the idea of folks using the word slave. And I say, you will never hear me use the word slave until I'm giving certain examples. I say enslaved, because when we say enslaved, what that does is that gives me a clear picture that there is a person who something was done to, and there was a person who was doing something to another person. Therefore, it gives me a clear picture of who the enemy is. When I label a group of people as being slaves, that dehumanizes those folks, turns them into objects, and then I'm not able to see the humanity in those folks. I'm not able to see them as somebody's mama, daddy, grandmama, hairdresser, scientist, philosopher, agriculturalist. I'm not able to see these things. And so we look at these particular titles, and again, I was not trying to be critical of the titles in and of themselves, but I think it becomes extremely important for us to make sure we understand that these titles are, again, a byproduct of the colonial disempowerment need to erase our identities overall. And so when we look at this, we go into that question of land. Mills talks about the idea of the racial contract. This is powerful. The people who created the racial contract, they simply said, ready, either you're European or you're not. They didn't care about all those things. In fact, if I can paraphrase Brother Malcolm said, look, you're not getting lynched because you're Baptist or because you're Methodist or because, right? Brother Malcolm said, listen, the people who are in power, they have a clear identity. See, they're not walking around trying to define anything else, right? It's us trying to say who we are. And again, we need to be able to say who we are, but using our own cultural standards, We look at the Ingulu Saba of Kuji Jagalia, self-determination. Our own cultural standards have to be able to define that particular reality. And we talked earlier about the ideal of education. And the question I have to ask is, whose education are we going to essentially begin to dismantle within creating a new reality for us all? We cannot operate in the oppressor's education. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad tells us that the only thing your former slave master can teach you is how to be a better slave. So we need to begin to have serious conversations about the late Mohawk conferences of the 1890s, where they had two questions they were trying to address. The N question, you all know the N word, I don't use that particular language, and the indigenous question. And the whole idea was, how do we construct an educational system to not empower these people, but to make them simply an extension of the colonial project? And so as early as the 1940s, there was the American Youth the American Youth Association, who some Black sociologists got together, well, social scientists, I'm sorry, I want to claim everybody as a sociologist, but there were some Black social scientists that got together, and they were doing research reports as a process of this. And one of the things that they found as early as the 1940s, their conclusion was that segregated schools was eventually going to create a revolution. And so as early as the 1940s, folks were already getting nervous about this and was already constructing ideologies for Brown. So people think of Brown as this victory, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, 1954, as being some type of victory. No, this was a product of what had already been laid down, had already been manifest and precipitated as early as 1890, because they understood that if we came together and we stopped using these things to dismantle and make separations between us, that there was going to be strength and there was going to be power within our unity. And so again, this is a byproduct of colonial disempowerment. We have to move away from that. We have to champion our own cultures, champion our own ways of knowing, champion our own ways of doing things. To finish, Malana Karanga tells us the most powerful thing in the world is to construct reality and have people accept it, even when it's to their own disadvantage. We have to begin to define things for ourselves.
So Dr. Harvell, let me ask you this, man. That is you gave so much, even for myself, you just put a steak in front of a baby, and that's a lot to process. So for you, let me ask you this: how do we create solidarity? How do we do that? What is the process of doing that? And you said a lot in what you said. So to kind of follow up with that, going into the next series of questions it would be that, rather than in, oppression Olympics, like how do we create that between Indigenous and Black? I realize the titles, I know that, but.
And again, I'm sorry, I want to make sure that you're asking me. I want to make sure that I'm not jumping ahead of anybody else. Okay, I want to make sure, I want to be respectful of all the wonderful people that are on this particular panel. One of the things we have to do is, again, as one of my heroes used to say, revolutions are fought, not taught. And so one of the things we have to do, this becomes a starting place, but a part of the starting place is there is nothing wrong with us having our own affinity groups. There is nothing wrong with us going by ourselves and building for ourselves without inviting other folk into these particular types of conversations. And this is not me saying, friends, that we shouldn't build alliances. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that, listen, we have enough problems amongst ourselves. W.E.B. Du Bois said, a people thus handicapped ought not be asked to rest with the world, but yet given time to essentially get together to resolve their own unique problems. We need to make sure that we're building these types of coalitions amongst ourselves first. Watch this. Begin to define the problems. Watch this, and make sure that we're defining the problems, not using the master script of what Schwartz calls, not using the master script of our oppressors. Too many times we define problems using the master script of our oppressors. I'll give you a basic example. In education, we're constantly talking about what? The achievement gap, the achievement gap, the achievement gap. Black and brown children not achieving on the same parallel as white children. There's no achievement gap. There is an access gap. See, when you say that there's an achievement gap right there, you create a system of defect. You create a deficiency within Black and brown bodies. There's something fundamentally wrong with these children. But if we recognize that there's not an achievement gap, there's nothing wrong with the children, but instead there's an access gap, meaning that if these young people had the same access to resources or equitable access to resources, they could perform just like everybody else. But again, let's be honest, equity is anti-patriotic. Equity is anti-American, equity is anti-capitalism, and so we're not going to get there. The revolution has to be fought, not taught.
Thank you, Dr. Harvell. Same question. I'm going to go to Mr. Sam Grant. This is also for you, creating solidarity beyond what is already in existence or lack thereof.
Yeah, so I'll talk in terms of concrete examples. So in Minnesota, we are organizing Black and Red formations. So we have a land justice strategy based on getting people back onto the land in commons-based formations, which means no debt for Black and Indigenous farmers to get back onto the land. And in exchange for getting onto the land with no debt, people are agreeing to 5 objectives. One objective is to bring back biodiversity. A second objective is to sequester carbon in the soil. A third objective is to nourish local living economies and not extractive, exploitive, destructive agriculture. And a fourth is to cooperate with the other farmers in the ecosystem across all the clusters. And the fifth is to ensure that there are clear lines of solidarity between Black farmers working on the land and Indigenous farmers working on the land and other BIPOC farmers working on the land. A second initiative that we're working on is looking at the opportunity to replant 1 million acres of the eastern broadleaf forest, which runs diagonally from the bottom right of Minnesota, the southeast, all the way to the northwest, and requiring that the way we replant that forest is under a co-management paradigm led by the Native nations in and close to the eastern broadleaf forest. In and around the Native nations, there's also opportunities to do repair of land ownership patterns and to look at opportunities to bring more of that land back into commons and get BIPOC farmers all the way across that diagonal across the state of Minnesota onto the land, working according to those 5 solidarity ecology organizing principles. So there's practical ways that we can work with each other now to get ourselves into right relationship with the land and with each other and respond to the climate crisis with true traditional ecological knowledge and shared ecological wisdom.
Well, people may not know how to do that, to work together to get to building decarbonization. Yeah. That's kind of you need to bake a cake, but I don't know how to bake a cake. We'll just bake one, so that's the beginning portion of that is what I'm really trying to really kind of get into within the next 4 minutes. I'll laugh because it's so not enough time to cover this, but getting people to work together from different brackets and coming into, and this is going to go over to you, Adelita, for
So can I say
you.
one more thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. Please
Just one
do.
more, and I apologize, my dear.
No,
panel,
absolutely.
Try not to hog space, but one example in the renewable energy space. We constructed a Just Solar Coalition in Minnesota. And part of our set of obligations to people working in the solar space was, if you are a white company, you got to commit to 51% of the people who you hire to come into your formation are people from BIPOC communities. And we have a whole lot of folks in our communities who are saying, I don't want to work for a white firm. I need to work for us, right? Which goes back to what Dr. Harvell was saying. We need to be us, for us and by us. So now there's people who are working on trying to create Black-led, Indigenous-led renewable energy formations, and then trying to redirect all of the support for the renewable energy revolution towards people who are leading from within our communities. And there are particular challenges that Black and Indigenous leaders face when they're trying to organize an economy for self-determination. So that's another question that we can't get at in this short time frame that we really need to talk through with each other.
Thank you for that. Adelita, moving over to you. Make sure you're unmuted.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
And so we're still on creating solidarity, right?
Correct.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, in the work here, as I mentioned yesterday, we developed a climate emergency resolution, and in that resolution, we were very inclusive. We, created space. Myself being there, it was really important that like white people kind of step down and be humble about their place, because as mentioned, they're heard more often than our voices. And so it was really important for them to acknowledge that and say, okay, we're going to listen and hear what you all have to say. And so that was really important, and finding folks like that, because that's the way, it's really important that when you're working with folks in the community, and also developing these strategies to, address the climate crisis and, who's being impacted, it's really important that you're working with people that are ready to acknowledge, their privilege and how they've been traditionally heard the most. And so that was really critical for us advancing the resolution, it being adopted, and creating that solidarity, and really important to also gaining the ears of our supervisors, our county board of supervisors, as many, we're looking at mostly white men, right? And so when we're meeting with them, they're meeting with us, we're saying, hey, we need you to seriously look at this, provide your input, but also hear us out. This is our demands. These are what we want the outcomes to be. And that was really important. We met with our supervisors one-on-one, and of course, it was important for the white folks to be like, we want you to lead this conversation. And that happened. And we were in a unique place where these allies, I like how Kaela said accomplices yesterday, they were like ready to say, we're going to step back, we're going to lift up your voices, and we're going to go through this process together. And we worked with farmers, we worked with different business owners. We really were trying to pull in voices that go traditionally unheard. And that required us to go in and, get some of this input, community input, and have folks step aside and listen to us and our knowledge and our insight about our own communities, and take our lead for once, And that's something that really, again, I think Colette said something yesterday about like humbling yourself. It's important for folks to say, we've tried our way. It's time for us to step back and listen to you and take your lead. And that happened here. And it's still something that is being worked on. It did help the solidarity in our community. and it is creating diversity, but is it already, is it perfect? No, it's an ongoing work in progress. But it did require that. It required white people to humble themselves and say, we want, we're going to listen to you. And that was important, because when you're working with governments and city and all, and if we're trying to say like, adopt this, it's important, or we're in trouble here, we're at a breaking point, we're at the 11th hour. It's important for all of us to work together, and that's what was required. And it's something we're still doing. Again, we're, on this commission, we're guiding the process, but is it perfect? No, this is uncharted territory right now. So we're leading here in that way. So it did create a solidarity, and we've made space for our people. So
okay. I know that Kaela, you raised your hand, so I'm gonna go over to you next.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in terms of solidarity, I know we're trying to get away from the oppression Olympics, but it's that triad of structural oppression that connects us all. The settler colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, all those things is unfortunately what pulls us together. The promises, the broken promises, the 40 acres and a mule that didn't happen, the treaties that are broken every other month, all those things are how we can relate to one another. But what's more important is like a relational solidarity. So this, recognizing that it's very complex and sometimes contradictory when we're looking at our personal stories, the stories of everyone's ancestors. So, it really just depends. And I'm trying to get back to this idea of land back and reparations. When we bring that to it, if you and this might be, this, might not sound right, but land-based reparations, if that's what we're looking at, they're not compatible with Indigenous liberation or sovereignty. They're not. That's like taking stolen land and giving it to people, giving it to Black people. It doesn't make sense. And I like what Sam was saying with the farming, and that's beyond, I'm not on that level of things. I do different work, but I understand what he was saying. And it has to be placed in land-based. We have to come together and do these things with that mindset, or we're not going to get anywhere. We're just not. To say we're handing out land or we're paying, I don't know how we're going to pay people. Who's going to pay us? I would love to get paid, but the thing is, there's already a thing called per capita that most natives get from their tribe, but not everyone. It's actually, I think, less tribes have per capita for their tribal members than do. And even at that, it's like, depending on the tribe, it's slim to nothing. Personally, my tribe get $500 one time a year, which is good, yeah, right. But that's gaming. That comes from gaming. So if you don't have that, you're not getting anything. And there's other tribes that get a whole lot of money. Then there's some that don't at all. Then you have to look at the tribes that are not federally recognized, and they're not getting anything. They're not even getting health insurance. They're not getting nothing. So we're all, there's so many different levels to this. And to make it equal or fair for everybody, if we're looking to the government to help us with that, impossible. I mean, I wish it wasn't, but how, right. Who, what, where, when, and how? That's my piece. I just wanted to share that whole random bucket of ideas and thoughts that I have right now.
No, it's not random. It's not random, and you're making some excellent points. And I'm glad. Also, if anyone wants to hit the raise your hand button, I will see that, and I can just go right over to you. So we're going to shift over to something else here, and I'm going to direct this question over to Colette about the climate. We're up against a climate crisis that both Black and Brown communities are faced. Flooding, pipeline burst, high utility rates, et cetera, et cetera. How can we create synergies and narrative that both reparations and land back needs to be to move forward in advance? Colette, this is for you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, everyone. And beautiful, it's amazing. I'm going to switch gears a little bit in order to answer this question. I would ask that everybody on here, when you have a moment of free time later on, I'm a professor, so you don't have to do this right away, on your own time. And I won't follow up on with you. I want you to go where you live right now, close your eyes, we call it going to ground, and I want you to imagine what that land looked like before anything modern, before all of this we're talking about, colonialism, settlerism, like for me, MMIW, the attack on Indigenous women and the land, Mother Earth, our babies, our children, Two-Spirit. I want you to think about and imagine what that land is. Center yourself first. It's going to call for, and I think some of our nations and Indigenous peoples have predicted this. We have prophets mine is sweet medicine in the Testas tribe. He predicted that this would come around where we would be in solidarity, fighting for one another. I come from a warrior tribe, so don't try me on that. It's embedded in my DNA. And there are different ways to attack the true enemy. And it's about keeping that spirit, whatever you believe in, to tether us all together. We would call it weaving us together. And respecting where we all are. So where you all are, I respect whatever it takes for you to honor that location-based effort you have to do. You know, however you believe, you know, what you call creator, I call creator Ma'eo. And however, you know, my Gatawage friends down the road by Montreal, what they call creator, you know, that would be my absolute, I'm begging each of you as my relatives on this panel and those of us who have tuned in and our friends and, you know, and our frenemies too, who are tuning in, I ask that you center yourself.
Absolutely. That I'm going to also, let me just go down to Tamara. Are you there? Your camera's off. I'm not sure if you're there, if you're with us or not. Yes, you are. Excellent. So the same question for you as of how can we create synergies as far as climate is concerned for brown and black, please.
So I think the question assumes we're not already doing that. Like, I don't come from spaces. I can speak about my own space and the places where I work and the people that I work with, but we don't treat each other like we're not in the same work. Like the dying on a fiery gas ball is like a global imperative that could care less about the levels of division that it takes for us to continue staying on that trajectory. So the people who I have blessed to be in community with are deeply clear that we don't have any problems that are bigger than doing a better job of taking care of our only home. And so I do not work with people who do not recognize that our various identities add richness to the conversation. I don't work with folks who don't recognize that there are a bunch of different disciplines, and what we're actually talking about is the politics of getting the places where we put all of our shared assets to do what we actually want, as opposed to what the people who are monitoring it on our behalf want to do with it in our name, right? So I do think that, like, as we speak, people are coming together for COP27, and the only thing on everyone's mind is loss and damage, climate reparations, and land back. So again, the conversation is happening in the context where the whole world is coalescing around a series of ideas. The questions around how much it costs are important because the answer is everything. It costs everything to deliver us to this terrible moment full of horrifying trajectories towards an exhausted, degraded planet full of exhausted, degraded people. So the idea that we would have to try to figure out how to reverse that without having a systems level conversation is why I think it's helpful to stay in the decarbonization space, because as a singular discipline, that's a part of a much larger conversation about how we do it. If we can't practice it in stuff we actually build, how are we going to practice justice, equity, belonging, or creating space for people to operate as they are in any other part of the work, much less the politics? So I am confident that all the folks on this panel are thinking about that in different ways. But I also think the trajectory we're on, unless we have the conversation at this level, is way more treacherous than if we were to try to figure out what parts of it we start with and who's first. Everything I put in the chat is either about how folks who are responsible, as we're in a moment where the last 2 generations bridges and tunnels are falling into the ground. That represents an opportunity for us to rebuild bridges and tunnels if it makes sense for us to do that. The idea that the transportation system is crumbling and electricity is changing, and what we say when we mean electrify everything is changing, is actually a real opportunity for everybody here in the communities we're connected to rethink the question of what are we going to do to redesign what's happening. So my hope is that in our various strategies and interventions, we will create some space to recognize that we're in a moment of transition, which has as much responsibility as it does opportunity. And I'm excited to connect about the opportunities where oppressed people spend their time thinking about how to get liberation with a capital L. Because even the people who do the oppressing don't benefit from it. Like, quiet as it's kept, money ain't all that. I'm just gonna put it there. I'm just going, if it were, people with money would be happier than they are. If it were, they would, the extractive processes that we spent this whole time talking about to move people's labor and energy and resources and care and understanding and souls from them would not be in exchange for something that could, like, the balance of assets doesn't add up. So I really think that in trying to think about wrapping up such a robust set of conversations is really, really plausible that the next design decisions we make could be for liberation, or they could be more of the same. And we all have an opportunity to weigh in on that. So I'm excited to be alive, as sad as it is.
Yes, absolutely. Kaela, you raised your hand. You had something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, because I'm thinking about the times you bring up, some people are ignorant to all of this. And these conversations are probably way, way past some people's heads, for sure. And so on a basic level, I just want to say, to create those synergies, it's about, and it has something to do with what Colette said about getting out there and grounding yourself. It's getting Black and brown, or I don't call myself red, I call myself brown, but Black and brown, Black and red, whatever, BIPOC people together on the land, with the land, and creating a relationship with the land and forming that reciprocity with the land, cultivating things, growing things, the trees, the maple trees, for example, there's a sugar bush, what we call a sugar bush here, where you tap the trees for the maple syrup and for the water to create the maple syrup and those things. And there's a great group here called Black to the Land that brings Black and brown folks together to do these things. And in creating a relationship to the land, in that reciprocity of doing those things, not only is it helping the land, because you've got to tap those trees, or that you have to do these things. You have to pick the sweetgrass. You have to pick and grow. You can't just, you don't just let it just be. You have to get in the land and do the work. And you create a relationship, and that builds that sense of belonging to the land that you're on, especially for the diaspora, for people who, were brought here in bondage and don't know what their real homeland is, but they're here now. And so doing those things, you build a relationship, you get that sense of belonging, and you start to care about the land that you're on. You care about clean water, you care about clean air, you care. If you're just going through your day to day, we're just working, we're just doing all these things, right? Some people don't even think about that. They're not thinking about where the water is coming from. They're not thinking about the air that they're breathing. They're not thinking about none of that. And so, like, Tamara, I just said, like what she's saying, if you're not thinking about those things, we're on a trajectory of destruction. It's happening. Everything, it's all happening, whether we like it or not. These things are happening. The world, climate change, all this, it's all coming for us, right? And so you have to start doing something about it. You have to start, reducing your footprint on all this as far as the negative impact. So this basic, get out there with other folks, learn, share knowledge, traditional knowledge. How did your people do these things? How did my people do these things? What did we do with these plant medicines? What did you do with these plant medicines? And share. And just share in reciprocity with each other and the land.
Absolutely. Sam, I think, do you have something you wanted to add?
No, I was just listening and appreciating. I wasn't about.
Oh, okay. All right. So
recognizing that Brother Imhotep has been silent and just hanging back for a while.
And
So I wanted to make sure he.
and I'm going to him next. So I'm glad you said that.
Go
So
ahead,
Michael, this is for you. So Michael, can we achieve equity through reparation and land back efforts? Is there still anti-Blackness in all cultures? That's the question for you, Michael, out of the gate.
Unmute. Okay. Can we
Yes.
achieve, because let me go to this slide here, because the question I prepared to answer for was how can we lift up movements and create synergies, but can we achieve reparations through, well, give me that question again.
Can we achieve equity through reparations and land back efforts is the question.
Oh, okay. Can we achieve reparations through equity and land back? Okay, so I think there is and I got I did prepare some information on that. So number one, there has to be a learning of both groups' history, African Americans' history and Native Americans' history. And at the same time, America, I said this a couple of days ago, Americans are very ignorant of history, okay? They're ignorant of their own history. White Americans, please don't take this the wrong way, but white Americans are very ignorant of their own history. If you look at an article from cbsnews.com from January 19th, 2021, it dealt with how most Americans don't understand the U.S. Constitution, don't know what's in the U.S. Constitution. This relates to their history as well, okay? So we have a shared struggle, and we're both victims of having land taken away as well. There has to be a unification, not just with the activists that are here and that are watching, that are Native American and African American, but also with those of those groups in general. Okay, there has to be a working together of those in general. There's a good article that I was going to share, and this deals with it's called Black, Native American, and Fighting for Recognition in Indian Country. Okay, so this is not against any of the Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians. Don't take this the wrong way. I have Cherokee on my mother's side of the family. Her family's from Tennessee. I have Cherokee and Blackfoot on my mother's side of the family. All right, but when we have this working together at the same time, those Black freedmen and those descendants of those Black freedmen that became part of the Native American nations, especially the Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians, they have to have their full rights restored also. And land that was taken back from them, taken away from them, okay, that land has to be returned as well. And in this story, it talks about a man named Ron Graham, whose ancestors were known as Creek freedmen, okay? And, you know, what are known as the 5 civilized tribes of Native Americans, this is what they were called, okay? They all owned African slaves, right? And when the Civil War, I talked about this Monday, Wednesday, when the Civil War ended, they were allocated land through what's known as the Black Freedmen Indian Treaties of 1866, okay? So part of this whole collective in us working together is also that land and those memberships of those Native American nations that I really think has to be resolved. And there has to be a learning of this shared history that we have. And we're both being oppressed by the same people as well. Under the previous administration, there was an incident where the executive branch went into, it was either North Dakota or South Dakota, and went on sacred Native American land without permission, which was a violation of a treaty. And I was watching it on MSNBC, and the reporter, his name was Shaq Brewster, he's African American. And what he was saying was that history of those treaties and of that sacred land is not taught largely in schools. So people don't know this history, okay? So, this is extremely important. I got a ton of other information, but I'll leave it there for, I'm trying to stay within 2 minutes, so I'll leave it there. If you have another question, Russell, let me know.
I would definitely, come back around to you. I'm going to ask the same question to Dr. Harvell. Make sure you're off mute there.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Absolutely, we sure can.
Okay, marvelous, marvelous. And again, this is, again, I'm not trying to go against the group, but I think that we are not critically assessing unequal power relationships. We keep talking about this idea of what we're going to do, as if some of these things have not already been done. So, for example, I always bring up, the work of Callie House as early as 1898, when she put together, this whole movement, the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Society. And in this particular society, we're talking about reparations. But what she was also doing is that they would collect dues to essentially help people pay for their medical issues, help people pay to buy land, help people pay to build schools and things of this nature, okay? And of course, that movement was squashed. We look at McIntosh versus Johnson, 1823, which set a very powerful precedent where one person bought land from a group of indigenous folks, another person was given the same land through a land grant from the so-called United States. And so the case was, well, whose land is it? Well, we know whose land it is. It's going to be the person who was given the land grant. But that case was extremely important in terms of setting a precedent, because they went all the way back to 1496. And they said, are you ready? This is unequal power relationships. They said that the indigenous people never had actual rights to the land. Said that the indigenous people, this is powerful, although they were living on the land, they did not have actual rights to the land because their leaders were not legitimate, predicated on what the European leaders said. That's powerful right there. When I can come and say that your leaders can't even talk. Your leaders can't even engage in a trade or anything of this nature because we do not recognize you. And so, of course, it became what? Open season. By 1831, Cherokee versus Georgia said, look, that indigenous folks can't even bring cases to the so-called United States. And then we talk about this notion of land. And again, I wanted to say this, we have to look at power. Think of all the times where land has been taken, which means that it can happen again. So we can get caught up in this whole idea of we're going to go and we're going to get this land and it's going to be a reparation for us all. And then what, 10 years from now, let's be honest about this. We have to look at the power. We have to look at what law is. The people in power do not create laws because they are moral people. They don't create laws because they're ethical people. The people in power create laws so they can maintain their power within the society. This is why laws change. So one day something is illegal. They look at this thing and realize they can get more power, and the next day it becomes legal. Now, how did that work? One day it's bad for you, the next day it's okay, because it was never about protecting the entire society equally. I'm right here in the city of Detroit, or the Detroit metropolitan area, and I always think about this place that's called the Black Bottom Paradise Valley. The state of Michigan came in, took this land, built a highway through this particular land, displaced all these people. The research actually talks about the fact that if this was a place where where Black folk were living because of segregation, they could not live in other places. Because they were segregated, they became what? Self-sufficient communities, right on the same as we see in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Self-sufficient communities where people are reacting to that notion of what happens in terms of segregation, building their own schools, own pharmacies, etc. Now, they displaced these people. Watch how powerful this is. The research says that if the Black Bottom and Paradise Valley had been able to essentially thrive, it may parallel places like Bourbon Street in Louisiana. Bourbon Street, we are, right? Beale Street in Memphis. Some even say, right, if it had been able to continue to thrive, it may parallel the Magnificent Mile in Chicago. Think about the economic prosperity, therefore, that this place could have essentially had destroyed because somebody came in and took the particular land. And I want to just throw this out. When we talk about the idea of money not solving problems, I'm sorry, this is capitalism. And what does capitalism tell us? In very, very basic terms, capitalism says what? Lie when you want, cheat when you can, steal when you feel like it, and kill whoever gets in your way. That's it. That's it. This country was founded on those particular principles. And so, for example, I'm from the city of Flint. I think about my family, my people in Flint still cannot drink water to this day, not because of something that they did, but because of the unequal power relations that were essentially happening that essentially helped to come in and undermine and dismantle what the folks have been doing for all of those years. And so, again, I think it becomes extremely important for us because we are not talking about power relationships. The racial contracts created a paternalistic race relations where it said that it was the Europeans' duty to essentially manage the rest of the world, because the rest of the world, they weren't even sure we were human, we were semi-savage. They had all these different typologies as to what the rest of us were. But the idea was to manage us. And so even when we complained about things, the way they explained it was, well, you know how children are. The medicine's supposed to help the child so that their child won't be sick. The child doesn't want to take the medicine because it's nasty. They use that to justify what? Enslavement. They use that to justify what? And I'm sorry, it's called the Trail of Tears. Why? Because I wrote the treaty, moved you 5 miles down the road, and then 3 weeks later when my cousin showed up, they wanted that particular land. And so the very treaty that I had just signed 2 weeks ago, that treaty was of sound and fury, signifying nothing, had no value whatsoever. It wasn't even as value as a piece of toilet tissue, used toilet tissue. Rescue me if I'm wrong.
So I just dropped a book in the chat called The Myth of Black Buying Power. And it's a good book. It actually talks about, it's controversial. It's not gonna make you feel warm and fuzzy, but it's an important book because the idea that people could ever become wealthy by virtue of the thing that is harming them is like a mind-blowing, that's a whole other conversation. That's gonna take a lot longer than this. But I will flag that it is virtually impossible to put together the idea that a group of people who have never been given any chance at actual prosperity or even the ownership and value of their own labor could cobble together out of that small fraction enough dollars to make anything happen. So it isn't about money not mattering, it's that we have exchanged things that are real for a thing the Treasury Department can make all day, every day without stopping. The amount of money that's falling out of the government in this moment where we're in, where inflation is making everything more expensive and the people's choice points around what they will get for things is proof. The amount of money that folks get that moves through this economy to create profiteering, enslavement, and harm outstrips any money, other money that we spend on anything else. But it is all exchanged for labor that comes from our bodies, our futures, and then the generations inside of the bodies that we send to do the labor. So I think I will respectfully argue that I think we are not in disagreement. I think we're in different parts of the conversation. And I also want to lift up that on a fiery gas ball of a planet, which is the one we're currently on, 5 years time, 10 years time, the amount of time it would take to amass the kind of capital that would move the trajectory has no bearing on the Earth's inability to make this a hospitable place for us in less time than that. Like the moment we are in right now is one where we either support the Earth's systems in balancing out our needs, desires, asks, and our labor, or we put it in a situation where all the feedback loops start making it less possible that we will be able to be here. So while it's really important for us to think this through, I think Jared Bell, Fred Moten, Olufemi Taiwo, amongst many other people have been thinking about the political and economic parts of it, but the climate, the planet, the stewardship parts aren't on that timeline. Like we don't have any more time to try to balance out our capacity because we've overextended the Earth's capacity. So I really would love for us to think a little bit about that and how decarbonization could help us to like stopping the bad thing. We have two kinds of power as oppressed people. We can build things or we can block things. But if we don't grow out of blocking things so we can start building things, we will not have a thing at the end of this conversation to build on.
Absolutely. So we're coming into our last about 10 minutes or so here. So I'm going to start with you tomorrow, which would be, what are the next steps for those new members, the new people in the building of the decarbonization movement? What are the next steps for those people? We know those that are already in and know what they know, but those that don't know, what are the next steps for those people?
It'll be quick so that our whole panel can get to the I'll say, I put in the chat the link to the CJ Pavilion, which is the Climate Justice Pavilion. The Climate Justice Pavilion that's going to be happening at COP over the next couple of weeks. It is the first Black and Brown pavilion in the Blue Zone, started by three elderly Black people over age 70, like opened up some space, and all of the movement finally has a place in this conversation where we can start to talk about our own practice across the various diasporas. So I think tuning into that, because people are going to be creating their own content about what they want and describing this in their own language from their own perspective. I also think we need to separate out the things we can do now and sequence what has to happen first in order for everything else to happen. So for me, that's climate reparations, land back, fossil fuel non-proliferation, and also making sure all this ungoverned capital that fell out of the government for the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't end up making white supremacy a more potent tool with which to divest us from any chance of doing what we all have to do together to survive.
Thank you. I'll go over to Adelita next.
Yeah, so I think, the most powerful thing we can do is organize in our communities, and just start from, the ground up there, and really, again, bringing in all the voices, those that have not been heard, those that are most impacted, the voices, the labor, all of the folks that are being impacted by climate change. And I think with the Inflation Reduction Act, really trying to redesign a plan for your own community, so that, again, as Tamara mentioned, it doesn't go to what, the folks that traditionally have the decisions, that you can take a piece of that and say, we want our neighborhood to be redesigned. These old, structures that are, now toxic to us and our families, that we need to get some of that and redesign our energy grid and make sure that it's being done in an equitable way. This is, right now is the time. We are, as I mentioned, I feel like we're at the 11th hour. We don't have a lot of time. We have to do it now. And so we have to start where we're at in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and organize and bring in the voices that are just not heard. Because why? We're like, we're working, we're doing 2 jobs, and, we're our kids. And so it's like these families that are typically stretched thin and don't have time, you have to meet those people where they're at, and you have to go to them and say, like, what are you experiencing? How can you, give your voice here and tell us how this money that's coming down the pipeline, how would you like to see it used? And that's really important. It's very powerful, I think, to do it in your community, as opposed to like, big, they're like, here's money, it's falling from the sky. Time to take it and empower our communities to use it.
Absolutely. We'll be going to Kaela. The question is, what are the next steps for those new members of the Building Decarbonization Movement? The next steps for those people. Kaela, floor is yours.
I would say just to educate yourself, and like Adelita's saying, get out in your community, start at the ground level of things. And a lot of things that we discussed yesterday, the asking of permission, the going to, especially if you're working with tribal communities, going to those tribal leaders or using your point of contact to get you into that place and space that then brings you to the elders who are most likely and should be, and most Native communities are the ones that are, going to be talked to first about what is the good way of going about doing these things, and then bringing the whole community together, working with the youth, especially, getting them involved, because they're the leaders, not the future leaders, they are the leaders. And we have to bring them into these conversations too, and help them to understand these things, because they're going to carry this work on. So I think that's the beginning steps. Get out there, and do it you can.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sam.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you for all of you for the great work you're doing in this space. I want to speak to, 2 aspects of Africana critical theory: revolutionary re-Africanization, which means wherever Black people are across the planet, to recognize that we have a common challenge because of anti-Black violence, and we need to organize the way that Huey Newton talked about revolutionary intercommunalism. Wherever you live, organize Black people there for common Black wellness and liberation. If you're on Indigenous land, wherever you are, organize for common Indigenous liberation in that place. And then the second part of Africana critical theory is revolutionary decolonization, which means we have to recognize that we're earthlings, which means that we can't just be anthropocentric and think about human life. We got to think about all of life, the two-legged, the four-legged, the many-legged, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl. We got to think about all of that because we're the last ones that got here. We're the most pitiful, us two-leggeds, the way that Dakota people call it, Unshika. We're the pitiful ones. So we have to respect all of life and learn, sit at the feet of all of life so that we can create convivial norms across the planet. So for the new people who are coming, it's our responsibility as people who think we have some insight at all to share it as broadly and deeply as we possibly can, because we are relatives to each other. Trying to be an individual is never going to get you anywhere. We got to take care and do leadership development constantly in every step, in every kind of campaign, in every formation. So it's got to be intercultural. It's got to be cultural.
Yeah,
it's got to be intercultural, and it has to be intergenerational, and it has to be based on traditional ecological knowledge.
Thank you. Colette, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was just mesmerized by Mr. Sam's words there. It makes me miss home. The Unchika, to hear that word. When I was growing up, my mother would often say that to us, you know, you're pitiful. And when you're pitiful, you go to Ma'eo, to creator. And you have to learn how to, I'm going to keep pushing this. I've started this. This is my first pitch I threw. We have to get creative in our solidarity, and I'm going to push us in the spirit. Our sacred ways and our connections to our mother it's tantamount. There will be no forward movement until that submission to our mother is there. And that requires getting comfortable in your relationship to the land, wherever you go across the whole globe, getting to know the land that you're on and making that connection to the land and submitting to the teaching or to your mother's teachings. The land is teaching you something. And I think a lot of my respected friends and colleagues on here have made it very clear that Mother Earth is crying out. We're in the 25th hour, I would say, to borrow that phrase from my Northeasterners. We're way past on that. She's been talking to us for a long time. And in that submission, I hope we can find the humility. I am going to make this plug. I think it's important that we also revitalize languages because of how our Indigenous languages talked about Mother Earth. It will really help you, I want to say, transform your thinking. And I think it's been a good point to not rely on that Western colonial system of how we talk about land as possession. We're connected to her. We're from her.
Absolutely. I'm going to go down to, and thank you so much for everyone of what you're saying. Absolutely. So, Michael, question comes to you.
Yep. And what was the question? Because I had to step away for a minute.
No. For new people, the new members, you know, what are the next steps for those people building decarbonization in this movement? That was the question.
Well, one of the things that I think is important to do is understand the history of what has already been done, and those have been pioneers in the field as well, because sometimes new people, they mean well, but they jump into a movement and think they invented something, okay, and don't really respect the ones that came before them. Okay, Harvell mentioned Callie House. Callie House, 1898, she's not really talked about when we talk about the whole reparations movement. You got people jump in and think they invented something. We have to understand how climate change negatively impacts everybody, but Latinos, Native Americans, African Americans, non-white people are disproportionately harmed by it. Okay, if we look at what just happened with Jackson, Mississippi, and the water supply. Okay, so I think it's important to understand that, study the history of the movement that you are part of, and then understand what can you bring based upon your unique gifts, based upon your experiences, etc. What can you bring to that movement? And then also focus on, and I'm not saying it's not being done, but for new people coming in, sometimes people confuse activity with productivity. And we want to make sure that for new people coming into movements, this movement and others, that they understand how to draw a direct line from the end goal that they want and the steps that need to be put in place to bring about that goal. I'm not saying people in the movement are not doing it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying when new people come into movements, a lot of times there's a lot of enthusiasm, things like that, and they don't draw a direct line between the end goal and the steps that need to be put in place to reach the goal. That's what I'm saying.
Got that. And going over to you, Dr. Harvell, as the last on this question here of what can those new people, the new members, what can they do? What are the next steps for those people? Dr. Harvell?
Brother Imhotep took my fire there.
I'm sorry.
The whole idea, peace and blessings, brother. When the brother was talking about the idea that we need to make sure that we're not trying to reinvent and make certain types of claims that we started these particular things, that becomes extremely important. Education becomes extremely important as well. And I do want to just briefly, if I may, I want to make sure I say that I was not suggesting that capitalism is somehow going to get us out of this. I'm saying that capitalism is the actual problem. And so the book that was put into the chat about the buying, yes, I'm a sociologist. I have read that particular book. It is a racialized, weak interpretation of Hegelian and Marx's understanding of alienation. And so we go back to the manuscript of 1844 or to Das Kapital, and we begin to understand that money in itself socially constructed the actual value. I'm not gonna go into all surplus value and all that good stuff. And so again, the book is a weak interpretation of those particular things. And so I was saying that capitalism is actually the problem, but with it being the problem, we're still not talking about unequal power relationships. And so I think that the most important thing for the new people is to begin to recognize those unequal power relationships and the way that those power relationships have been carried out historically, how they continue to be carried out, and how they're going to continue to be carried out. Some of us, right, are old enough to remember sitting in college classes back in the 80s and the 90s, and the conversation that we're having now, sitting in geology classes, and they were talking about this impending global doom that was going on. They were sounding the alarm many, many years ago. We looked at the work of Oliver Cox. He was doing world systems theory before Immanuel Wallerstein. We're talking about the early 1920s. And so folks have been sounding the alarm on this stuff for many, many years, but the people in power have been unconcerned. Why? Because all they care about is more greed and the amassing of more capital. So that was really my critique. No, I'm not a capitalist, but at the same time, I think for those of us who have privilege, it's easy for us to say, well, you know, money doesn't matter. I'm sorry. Go tell some of my people up in Flint that money doesn't matter when they're paying for water that they cannot use, buying water bottles so that they can essentially use that, and then how that impacts the access that they have to other things in terms of their other needs being met. And so I think it's easy for those of us whose bellies are full to say things like money does not matter. We have to recognize our privilege. And I'm sorry, y'all can't see if I stand up, my belly is full. So you're never going to hear me say that money doesn't matter, because I know why my belly is full, because I have certain types of privileges. In fact, for us to be on this call right now, let's be honest, is a privilege. Is a privilege. There are folks, right, who are still at work right now, and they have 3 more hours, 4 more hours, 5 more hours. And so when we say that people are not thinking about these things, because they can't, it's a privilege to even have the time to be able to think about these types of challenges, these types of unequal power relationships. Some folks have to be thinking about, guess what? Putting food on the table, making sure the lights are on, and the kids got shoes. Thank you so much, brother.
Thank you so much to everyone. And so much information, so many good words. I wish we had more time to do a deep dive into all of the things that we were talking about today. But I wanted to thank all of the panelists here. Tomorrow too, Tlayolotl, Sam Grant, Dr. Harvell, Kaela Harris, Adelita, Serena, Colette, Yellow Robe, and Michael Imhotep. I want to thank everyone for being a part of this. Those that are watching, those that are on the live stream, thank you for tuning in. If you were here for all 3 days, amazing. If you're just here for today, that's good. If this is a beginning for you, please keep getting more information. Slides will be available, so feel free to reach out to everyone you see on the screen here. And just keep the movement alive, keep the movement going, and keep learning. Because information is something that we can't do without, and that's what we've been sharing here today. So again, my name is Russell Rabb. I've been your moderator for today. I thank you all for being here and showing up, and have an amazing and a blessed day. Thank you all. Good night.